The palace was silent until King Charles' private secretary made a midnight call to the royal bank. Within hours, Camilla's personal accounts were locked, her cards declined at Claridge's, and whispers raced down the marbled halls. No warning. No explanation. Just one chilling word from the king: freeze. What did he know that no one else did? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It started with a quiet hum of unease, a barely audible tremor behind the polished veneer of Buckingham Palace. While most of the royal household had settled into the rhythm of another ceremonial week, the king was pacing. Not with the grace of a sovereign, but with the sharp, deliberate tension of a man cornered by something far more dangerous than politics: betrayal. That night, inside the crimson-draped war cabinet room, a hastily assembled circle of advisors sat frozen as Charles, eyes sunken and voice taut, uttered the irreversible order: suspend all of her personal financial activity. Effective immediately. The silence that followed was deafening. Not a single advisor dared ask why not yet. Camilla, oblivious to the storm about to erupt, was enjoying an intimate private dinner at her favorite suite in Claridge's when her first card was declined. She laughed it off. Technical glitches were hardly uncommon. But when her second and third cards failed, and her private security received a direct call from the Crown's financial liaison, her amusement curdled into disbelief. Within minutes, she understood. This wasn't a mistake. It was an attack, an orchestrated, calculated act of aggression from her own husband. And it wasn't just financial, it was personal. Back at the palace, the atmosphere was electric. Staff whispered behind doors, glancing nervously at the Queen Consort's wing. Word spread like fire. A midnight order. No explanation, just the unmistakable tension of a royal house in disarray. Tense and surreal, one royal aide later described it. The air was thick with fear of scandal, of collapse, of truths that had long been buried clawing their way to the surface. For decades, Charles had stood by Camilla through thick and thin, through public scrutiny, familial resistance, and Diana's enduring legacy. To the world, his loyalty had been unwavering. So why this? Why now? Some believed it was political, a maneuver to shield the monarchy. Others whispered darker theories that something had been discovered, something dangerous enough to force a king to weaponize silence against the woman he once risked everything for. Still, Charles remained publicly mute, allowing headlines to multiply and theories to spiral out of control. Camilla, never one to remain passive, immediately demanded a private audience with the king. She received nothing, no reply, no meeting, just an eerie, calculated silence. It was as if Charles had vanished emotionally from the marriage overnight. And that silence screamed louder than any confrontation ever could. But what could possibly drive the monarch to turn on the woman he once defied the world to love? The answer lies buried in the shadows of a secret investigation. Long before the freeze, a quiet team of forensic accountants slipped into the royal ecosystem. No announcements, no paperwork trails. Their mandate? Find discrepancies, follow the money, and report to one man only: King Charles himself. What they discovered would rattle the foundations of the monarchy. The operation began in whispers and shadows. An elite financial intelligence firm contracted through a private channel, their identities concealed even from palace administrators. Charles, increasingly disturbed by vague anomalies and discretionary spending reports, bypassed royal auditors entirely. This wasn't a routine audit. This was covert, personal, and fueled by suspicion that had been quietly festering. The team wasn't granted access through official doors. They were handed a different kind of key: direct entry into the kingdom's most guarded digital corridors. From Balmoral's stone walls, encrypted instructions were sent through secure satellite uplinks. Hushed meetings took place not in palace offices, but in remote countryside manors under the cover of family retreats. The king insisted on total silence, knowing that even a whiff of internal investigation could detonate a scandal of monumental scale. Within days, the red flags began to pile up. Transfers made at strange hours, large withdrawals routed through obscure intermediary institutions, and inconsistencies in charitable fund flows that defied legitimate explanation. What first appeared to be sloppiness quickly unraveled into something deliberate. The team traced donations intended for joint royal foundations being siphoned into accounts located in Gibraltar, the Cayman Islands, and a trust quietly operated under a pseudonym by someone who, upon further digging, was revealed to be a distant cousin of Camilla's former lady-in-waiting. The deeper they went, the murkier it became. Transaction trails twisted into knots, leading investigators into a maze of foreign shell corporations allegedly linked to social initiatives that either didn't exist or had been mysteriously shut down months earlier. And yet, it wasn't just the funds that sent shivers up the king's spine. It was the timing. Several of the most questionable transactions coincided directly with Camilla's personal overseas visits trips that had never raised alarms until now. Reports were compiled and recompiled. Burners were used to send discreet updates. The lead investigator's final call before full disclosure carried just 6 chilling words: "We've found enough. She's involved." Days later, the sealed file landed in Charles's hands, embossed with the palace crest, but marked in red, "Urgent, Phase 2 required." What lay within that folder was more than just a financial web. It was a narrative of betrayal laced with methodical precision. The implication was no longer vague. The evidence was damning. The king stared at the documents for hours. Advisors said he barely blinked, barely moved. The man who had once declared love above duty now found himself trapped between silence and survival. And when Phase 2 was initiated, everything spiraled because the queen wasn't just implicated, she was at the center. Jewels, jets, untraceable transactions. The Queen's private financial empire stretched far beyond what the public or press had ever imagined. Now, with the veil ripped away, the shocking scale of her undisclosed wealth and how it moved left the royal family reeling. It began with properties no one had ever heard of: lavish estates in the south of France and secluded beachfront villas tucked away in the hills of Morocco, all quietly purchased over a decade using names that didn't trace back to Camilla directly, but to obscure shell companies bearing the fingerprints of those within her intimate circle. The investigators, once focused solely on expenditures within Britain, now found themselves swimming through a global network of concealed assets. Each revelation peeled back another layer of deception, and at the core of it all was a woman many believed had nothing to hide. The names attached to the foreign holdings pointed to a pattern: aliases repeated across multiple jurisdictions, but always orbiting around a single constant: Camilla's cousin, long dismissed as a socialite with no political ties, now revealed to be the quiet executor of a sprawling offshore financial scheme. But the most damning discoveries weren't the locations, it was the movement of money. Tens of thousands at first, then hundreds of thousands, slipped out through philanthropic partnerships that were never publicly announced nor audited. Events billed as fundraisers lacked financial records, and certain donor lists were mysteriously redacted from royal archives. Travel itineraries originally funded by the crown now appeared on the books of so-called charities with questionable legitimacy, creating a murky overlap between personal luxury and public duty. Jets hired for official appearances were extended for private leisure, lodgings upgraded, companions added, yet nothing formally documented. Staffers began speaking up quietly, anonymously, and only when promised complete protection. One insider admitted that Camilla insisted several expenses never be entered into formal ledgers, often justifying them as gifts to the monarchy or personal entitlements. The lines between royal privilege and unchecked indulgence blurred beyond recognition. Even the Queen's famed jewelry collection, long considered one of the most guarded and inventoried assets in the realm, came under scrutiny. Pieces once displayed during state dinners were now missing, and in their place nearly indistinguishable replicas had appeared. The implication was sinister: someone had swapped them out, and someone had known how to do it without raising alarms. What emerged wasn't just a scandal, it was the portrait of a second monarchy, hidden in plain sight. One where loyalty was currency, luxury was power, and the crown's name became a veil to conceal an empire built behind locked doors and encrypted files. She ran her own kingdom behind palace walls, one royal aide confessed, voice shaking with disbelief. And it was a kingdom with its own rules, its own wealth, and its own secrets Charles had never fully grasped until now. But Camilla wasn't just spending, she was also hiding. And what she was hiding may have triggered the king's harshest move yet. Doors slammed, voices rose, For the first time in years, King Charles and Queen Camilla faced off in a confrontation so fiery, aides were ordered out of the corridor. What began as a private reckoning turned into a war of words that shook the palace's very core. The moment Charles stepped into her chambers, the air thickened with dread. In his hand, the infamous dossier pages of damning financial records, account trails, and confidential witness statements. Camilla, still reeling from the account freeze, stood her ground, daring him to explain. But he didn't speak. He handed her the file and waited. As her eyes scanned the evidence, the room fell deathly quiet until her voice cracked through the silence. Not with guilt, with fury. She accused him of treason, of orchestrating a public spectacle designed to humiliate her beyond repair. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from disbelief. She had stood beside him as the world doubted them. And now, he doubted her. Charles, resolute but visibly shaken, refused to back down. The confrontation escalated quickly, no longer just about money, but about loyalty, power, and a deep fracture that had clearly been growing long before the investigation. Palace insiders later revealed that their shouting was audible 3 halls away. One described the energy as volcanic. Another simply said, it felt like something ended that night. When Camilla declared she would leave the palace altogether, Charles allegedly responded without hesitation, "Then go." And that was the line that shattered any illusion of reconciliation. Advisors who had once carefully managed every breath of the royal couple found themselves locked out literally. The king had ordered all intermediaries to stand down. No calls, no counsel, no distractions. This wasn't a situation to be handled with royal protocol. It was war, and it had turned internal. For 48 hours, Camilla vanished behind locked doors, declining food, refusing aids, and answering to no one. Her quarters became a fortress of silence. Staff described the atmosphere as grim, uncertain, and riddled with fear that the queen might go public in her rage. But while Camilla isolated herself, Charles was already preparing the next shocking move, one that would involve parliament, public scrutiny, and permanent damage. When whispers of Camilla's frozen accounts reached Westminster, panic set in. Advisors begged Charles to contain the storm. But it was too late. One classified leak had ignited a political inferno, and the monarchy's darkest chapter was about to be written in public ink. It started with a single headline. A tabloid exclusive that claimed the Queen Consort had been financially sidelined by the king amidst an internal corruption probe. Within hours, the story spread like wildfire. Anonymous sources detailed the alleged unauthorized use of sovereign funds tied directly to Camilla's private activities. The leak, though clearly timed and orchestrated, pierced the wall of secrecy Buckingham Palace had fought to maintain. It was no longer a family matter, it was now a national controversy. And in the age of instant outrage, public reaction came swift and merciless. Across social media, hashtags trended demanding transparency, and opinion polls showed confidence in the monarchy plummeting overnight. No one, not even the staunchest royalists, could ignore the implications. The crown itself was under fire. Inside Parliament, pressure mounted. The Privy Council, typically silent and ceremonial, convened an emergency session and demanded a full accounting from the palace. Government ministers, once allies of Charles, began to retreat, privately warning that any further concealment could ignite a constitutional crisis. The optics were unbearable. While the nation battled economic strain, the image of a queen allegedly funneling money through lavish accounts and private networks was too grotesque to defend. The firm, once a symbol of stoic dignity, now stood accused of its own complicity. The fallout inside the palace was no less severe. Multiple senior aides tendered resignations within a 72-hour window. Some walked away citing moral objections, others out of sheer survival instinct. Rumors of document shredding, late-night exits, and secret meetings fed the chaos further. The monarchy was bleeding, and the public wanted answers. Every silence from the palace echoed like guilt. Every non-response deepened suspicion. Even the tabloids, once deferential to Camilla, turned vicious, labeling her the queen of deceit and speculating about potential exile. The storm was no longer approaching, it was here. In a moment few saw coming, Charles was forced to do something he had long avoided. He picked up the phone and called the Prime Minister. Sources suggest the conversation was brief, formal, and fraught with tension. The king offered what he had hoped never to utter: cooperation. That single word would open the floodgates to public scrutiny, political oversight, and possibly irreversible damage to the crown's authority. But Charles knew he had little choice. The nation was watching. And for the first time in decades, the royal family wasn't being scrutinized for tradition, it was being scrutinized for corruption. And yet, while Parliament demanded accountability, another voice emerged, one no one expected, and one that would shift the entire power dynamic. Prince William had remained silent. Until now. In a stunning turn, the heir to the throne intervened not to defend Camilla, but to protect the crown. What he demanded behind closed doors changed the monarchy's trajectory and Charles' grip on power forever. It was the moment the palace had been dreading. The heir, long known for his calculated restraint, requested a private meeting with his father not as a son, but as the future sovereign. The tension was suffocating. William, armed with the full breadth of the public fallout and the confidential audit findings, did not mince his words. He didn't ask for clarification. He demanded decisive action. Transparency, accountability, and above all, distance. His words, though measured, struck with the weight of a future king's authority. Insiders later revealed that William referred to Camilla's financial conduct as unbefitting of a future queen, and a danger to the credibility of the institution. The impact was immediate. Charles, though outwardly composed, was visibly shaken. No rebuke, no denial, only a long, stunned silence followed by a promise to consider the implications. But William wasn't there to ask permission. He was there to draw a line. With his father hesitant to act decisively, William began shifting the ground beneath him. Trusted aides within Clarence House were quietly reassigned. Loyalists to the Queen were frozen out of upcoming events and briefings. Those who once operated at the heart of royal coordination suddenly found themselves sidelined. William's influence grew not with grand gestures, but with silent precision, one conversation at a time, one advisor at a time. He knew where the power flowed, and he was redirecting it with terrifying effectiveness. As the days passed, the split between father and son became undeniable. Meetings that once included both now excluded one. Joint appearances were postponed, allegedly for scheduling conflicts. But behind the scenes, the fractures were obvious. Courtiers described an atmosphere of quiet chaos, where alliances were questioned and loyalties redrawn. Some staff whispered of an unspoken transfer of command already underway, one in which Charles remained king in title, but William was becoming king in practice. It wasn't rebellion. It was preservation. William saw the writing on the wall, the monarchy teetering under scandal, the public's patience thinning, and a queen whose actions had cast a long and dangerous shadow. In his eyes, the survival of the crown demanded action his father seemed unwilling to take. And so, he acted. Not with violence, but with quiet power. Not with fury, but with strategy. But while William moved strategically, Camilla was preparing for war, both legal and personal. Humiliated and cornered, Camilla wasn't about to go quietly. She lawyered up, reached out to old media allies, and most shockingly threatened to release private recordings that could devastate the monarchy. The Queen had claws, and she was finally showing them. The woman who once walked the halls of Buckingham as a quiet force behind the throne now emerged as a storm of retaliation. Camilla, no longer bound by royal protocol, assembled a legal dream team within 48 hours, elite attorneys with a reputation for shielding billionaires and silencing institutions. At their side, a crisis PR firm known for flipping scandals into sympathy campaigns. From the moment the first letter was delivered to the king's legal office, her intentions were clear. If the palace didn't unfreeze her accounts, she was ready to take the monarchy to court. Not just any court, she threatened to escalate the matter publicly, ensuring it would not stay behind the palace gates. Camilla's narrative flipped rapidly. Through controlled leaks and strategic whispers, she painted herself not as a thief, but a target set up by royal insiders desperate to preserve their own reputations. She described herself as a scapegoat, the convenient casualty in a crown scrambling to cover its own financial mismanagement. A victim of politics, not wrongdoing. Those close to her say she worked the phones relentlessly, contacting carefully selected journalists she had cultivated over years. Promises were made. Off-the-record conversations held in hushed tones. And in those conversations, she hinted at something explosive: private recordings. The very idea sent shockwaves through the palace. Recordings? Of what? And with whom? Camilla refused to clarify. Instead, she dropped just enough hints to provoke paranoia. She had, she claimed, documentation of sensitive conversations, some between senior royals, others involving political figures, conversations that, if made public, could shift public sympathies and demolish the illusion of harmony the royal institution had fought to maintain. The silence that followed from the king's camp spoke volumes. No legal rebuttals, no public denials, just tension. And then came the personal. In a rare act of emotional vulnerability or strategic manipulation, Camilla sent a handwritten letter to Charles, not through aides, but delivered directly. It reportedly pleaded with him to remember their decades together, to see through the fog of pressure and betrayal. But beneath the sentiment lay a threat draped in sorrow. If he didn't protect her, she wouldn't protect him. Those who read the letter called it haunting, part love note, part war cry. And Charles once again was left staring down a woman he thought he knew, unsure if what stood before him was a betrayed wife or a calculated adversary. And yet, as Camilla prepared her next move, a twist from the past emerged, one tied to Diana, and a long-forgotten secret. Just when the monarchy teetered on collapse, a private letter from the late Princess Diana surfaced, sealed and unread for decades. Its contents, haunting and prophetic, cast a new light on the royal chaos and delivered a devastating message about trust, betrayal, and destiny. It came from an unexpected place, a dusty leather box buried deep within the belongings of an old friend of Diana's, long forgotten and untouched since the late 90s. Hidden among childhood photos and handwritten notes was a sealed envelope marked in Diana's unmistakable script, to be read only if it ever falls apart. And now, with the monarchy embroiled in a scandal of frozen accounts, secret recordings, and an all-out internal war, it had fallen apart. The letter's discovery was nothing short of fate. When the friend who found it reached out to William, it wasn't out of opportunism, it was a cry of conscience. A mother's warning, unheard in her time, was now screaming through the silence. The letter was authenticated within hours. Experts confirmed the handwriting. No forgeries, no manipulations. Just Diana's unfiltered truth, inked in her signature blue. What she wrote stunned everyone who read it. She spoke of looming danger, not of enemies abroad or the press, but of rot within the palace. She described her fear of financial vultures in the palace and warned of a woman, unnamed but carefully described, as someone who knows how to manipulate the men around her, especially those desperate for love and loyalty. There was no need to name Camilla. The implication was searing. And it struck William like lightning. He didn't hesitate. The letter was placed in a leather folio and personally handed to King Charles. There were no couriers, no intermediaries. Just a son giving his father the last words of the woman whose absence still haunted them both. What followed, insiders say, was the most emotionally devastating meeting the two had shared in years. Charles read the letter silently, jaw clenched, tears welling but never falling. When he finished, he reportedly uttered just one word: why? It wasn't directed at William. It wasn't even a question to be answered. It was the voice of a man whose past choices had just risen to destroy the present he thought he had secured. The fallout was immediate. Decades of buried guilt, suppressed grief, and unresolved anger flooded to the surface between father and son. William, torn between duty and rage, reportedly told Charles that all of this might have been avoided if he'd ever truly listened to her. Charles, broken but defiant, offered no defense. What defense could there be when the dead were now speaking clearer than the living? But Diana's voice from beyond the grave wasn't the end, it was the spark. And what came next would alter the monarchy's fate in a single breath. After weeks of turmoil, the king emerged stoic, hollow-eyed, and irrevocably changed. In a chilling address to the nation, Charles finally broke his silence. What he said about Camilla stunned the world, and what he didn't say spoke even louder. The broadcast was brief, the tone somber, the setting stripped of grandeur. A single flag hung in the background as King Charles addressed a nation still reeling. In carefully measured words, he acknowledged what many had feared but few dared speak aloud: There had been financial irregularities involving royal expenditures. No names were directly mentioned, no fingers pointed. But the implication was clear and deafening. Camilla's absence from his side spoke volumes, and when her name finally did pass his lips, it was wrapped not in affection, but formality. He announced that the Queen Consort would be temporarily withdrawing from public duties until such matters are fully resolved. The statement, though polished, landed like a blade. He continued, offering reassurances that the institution would remain committed to transparency and accountability, no matter how painful that path may be. But as his eyes remained fixed on the camera, his voice never wavered, never cracked. Observers noted how emotionally detached he sounded, especially when speaking of Camilla. There were no personal words, no warmth, no defense. The silence between each sentence felt like a verdict. The man who once defied an empire to love her now stood before that same empire appearing as though he'd already made his choice, and it was no longer her. The aftermath was instant and explosive. Social media fractured into warring factions, some offering quiet sympathy to a visibly aged monarch, who looked like the weight of the crown had finally broken him. Others condemned the palace's vague language, demanding concrete answers and full disclosure. Camilla's supporters called it character assassination wrapped in royal protocol. Her critics, however, saw it as vindication. The queen was no longer untouchable. But behind palace walls, the energy was far from resolved. Staffers whispered of shifting roles, of new alliances being formed in quiet corners. Charles, once the emotional center of the family's fragility, now carried himself like a man who had sealed a door shut on his past and dared no one to open it again. But if history had taught anything, it was this. The royal family doesn't recover by silence. It festers in it. But behind palace walls, the story isn't over. Because in the monarchy, silence is never the end. It's the beginning of the next betrayal. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.